My name's Patsy Rublin. I'm here with Mitch Green, who will be interviewed today, Denton Koyman, who will be running the camera, Nancy Green, who is our logger. We're members of the Malden chapter of the Missouri Veterans History Project. This recording is being completed here at the Boot Hill Youth Museum in Malden, Missouri. Today is June 21st, 2017. So, Mitch, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about where you were born and what year?
I was born October 24th, 1963 in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. My parents moved to Bartlesville after my father graduated college, and he worked for Phillips Petroleum, which is Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And then I think I was 2 years old when we moved back to Malden, which is where my parents and my grandparents and all the rest of my family was from.
Oh, okay. And do you have any siblings?
I do. I have a sister who's a few years older than me, and then I have a stepbrother who's a few years younger, so I became the middle child.
Oh, bummer for you. Sorry, I know what that's like. What were you doing before you entered the service?
Well, I grew up in Malden, went to school all the way to kindergarten through 12th grade in Malden, graduated in 1982, and then I went to the University of Missouri for a short period of time.
Can you tell us a little bit about Malden?
Oh yeah, it's great. Like I said, all of my parents both grew up here. My stepmother's from Bernie, and then my stepfather was from Jamestown, Tennessee.
Big town, little town?
Malden. When I graduated, it was a little over 5,000 people, 5,300, something like that. And you know, it was just a farming community. Everything around here kind of ran based on how the farming seasons went.
Okay. How many people did you graduate with?
I want to say there were 118 in my class.
Wow, that was a big class for Malden.
It was.
So you went to the university.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you stop going to the university?
It didn't take me long to figure out I wasn't college material. And like we just said, I graduated with a small class, and when I got to Missouri, the first class I had was a 2-hour lecture with 250 students. And the first class, the first day, that one about did it to me. But I tried to soldier on, it just didn't work out.
What class was it?
It was a communications class, believe it or not, yeah.
With 250
yeah.
people, wow.
Yeah.
I would have dropped out too. So how did you end up in the military?
So after the first year, my parents and I had a long talk, and I was told what I needed to do, obviously, and I went back for in the fall of '83, and not long before the semester was up, I decided to join the military. Didn't tell anybody. I went down to the recruiting station in Columbia and walked in the front door. The recruiting station, all the branches were there, and the first door was the Army. So there I went. Got hold of a recruiter. We started the paperwork that day, and a few weeks later came home for the Christmas break. Broke it to the family. A lot of my cousins were quite entertained about it. Quite a Christmas surprise. And then, excuse me, in January I started doing paperwork and all at the MEPS, Military Enlistment Processing Station in St. Louis.
And why were your cousins so surprised? Were you a
Oh, everybody
rebel,
was.
or what?
Yeah, it was not. It was, nobody would have thought that of me at the time.
Really?
Yeah, it was quite a surprise to everybody. At the time, we had a joke stocking for Christmas that Santa Claus would leave joke gifts for, and a lot of them were Army based that year, for both me and my parents. And
Wow.
yeah, I thought they were a lot funnier than my parents did.
Yeah, I'll bet. Did your parents give you any advice or anything?
Yeah, don't do it. But it's too late, because I already signed up by then. But no, they were surprised, but like, you know, they shook their heads a lot and worried. And that really was mostly it. Just good luck and go get them after that.
So did you join because you were a patriot, or did you just didn't know what else to do?
I was 20 years old and didn't know what else to do. I always liked working. I always had jobs growing up. first job was working at the horse stables, so you can imagine the kind of jobs I had there. Worked at the horse stables, worked at the grocery stores carrying out, worked at the radio station for years, just did whatever during the summer, and knew that I wanted to work. I didn't want to go to school.
And so what year is this?
I signed up, went to the recruiters in the fall of '83, and then I left for basic training in February of '84.
Was there a military conflict going on right then?
No, it was the Cold War was the big thing, of course. You know, it was all, what do we do if Russia attacks, or we attack Russia? So yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk more about that. So between the time you turned right and the time you got off the bus, or if you did get off the bus at boot camp, how long did it take?
Oh, well, I went in the recruiting station again, I think it was November, and went to the MEP station again in St. Louis for the physicals and tests and the paperwork and the actual swearing in, all of that in January, and I was at basic training, I think February 6th.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they, I think they didn't want to give you time to change your mind, basically.
Smart, smart. So what was it like when you got off the bus at boot camp?
It's about like you see in most movies when they show boot camp. Lots of wide-eyed, scared kids and drill sergeants yelling and pointing and learning how to run everywhere you went. Wasn't too bad though. It was shocking for the first few minutes, and then I spent a lot of time just taking everything in. It was picking up gear, getting shots, being told who you were and who you weren't anymore, and learning that a drill sergeant works for a living. You know, they heard that quite a lot. So it was a busy first few hours. I got there in the early evening. I remember that. It was just getting dark. I flew to South Carolina, took a bus to Fort Jackson, and it was just getting dark. And yeah, it was quite a dark night.
Was it a military bus or just a civilian bus?
No, it was. It was a bus from Fort Jackson, and I want to say it was kind of a.
Did you talk to anybody on that bus?
Well, you're on there. The first military guys are on there that you see, and everybody's kind of asking each other, "What do you think is going to happen?" You know, lots of. Nobody was really. Nobody had their chests out anymore. Everybody was a little bit more timid on the bus.
Okay. All guys?
It was, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, who was your first drill instructor?
Staff Sergeant Jerome P. Harper. I will remember that name from now on, from February of '84. He was like every drill instructor you could imagine. Very fit, had that drill instructor hat we called the brown round, and he wore it well. He was, we call him Strack. When you look good in your uniform and stand up straight, that was Sergeant Harper. Square-jawed, and he really could get onto you, but everybody thought he was a good guy. You know, he could really get after you, but nobody ever seemed to get mad at him or upset with him, or it all worked out pretty good.
So what did he get after you about?
The one I really remember, one time we were at the rifle range, and I had done something to aggravate him, which, you know, we all did, and I think if you didn't, they just found something once in a while. But I remember he had me doing push-ups, and you know, I hadn't been out of high school too long, so I was still in pretty good shape from sports in high school, and so push-ups weren't any big deal, and in the running and everything else wasn't any big deal. Sometimes just figuring out how to do some of the obstacles. But I was doing push-ups, and I was thinking about something at high school. I want to say it was something during football practice. I have that in my head. I don't know if that's true, but I kind of had a grin on my face. And he spent about the next 30 minutes getting rid of that grin. He and I became pretty good friends that day, in a way.
So what does that mean? Were you doing push-ups for 30 minutes, or?
No, I was, I can't remember what they called it, but a 5.5-pound rifle gets really heavy when you run with it above your head for minutes, and
wow.
and through trees and up and down bleachers that were at the firing range, and anything he could think of, I got to do.
No smiling.
No.
Okay, well that's interesting. So did you have any close buddies? You know, did you get to know anybody?
You know, not in basic. Everything just went so fast. We had a guy get injured, who was taken out. When our class started, we had a guy in our class who was injured in his cycle. So he was what they called a holdover, and he was waiting until our class got to the point where he was taken out for medical reasons during his cycle. And we came in one day from the rifle range, and a buddy of mine and I just happened to be in the barracks first, and we heard some noise in the latrine and this awful smell, and we went to the latrine, and he had 6 or 8 bottles of modeling glue, and he had it all over his face and his hands, and yeah, so drill sergeant and a couple of guys got him out, and we never saw him again.
Was he trying to hurt himself, or was he just sniffing the glue?
Well, I had to say he's hurting himself, because he was also in the floor, and he had one of the bathroom stall doors, and he had his head down, and he kept, that was the noise we heard when we came in, the pounding was the door hitting himself in the top of the head.
Good Lord.
Yeah, obviously had some problems, but.
Okay. Wow, okay. That's scary. My dad used to tell me about fire watch. Did you have to do anything like that?
Yeah, and evidently the drill sergeants get a kick out of that. I remember the first time I had fire watch, we had a big open bay. I think there were 55 of us in the bay. Had bunks down either exterior wall, and then down the middle the bunk heads met, and then lockers between all the bunks everywhere. And I just happened to be at one end of the bay that evening, and I saw the fire door on the opposite end come open. I just happened to be looking in the right direction, and I saw this dark figure going low across the floor, and I thought it was one of my platoon mates that had gotten out and was sneaking back in. So I went down the other aisle, and Sergeant Harper came around the corner on his stomach while I was standing there. And I said, "Good evening, Sergeant Harper." And he stood up, and we went outside, and he inspected my uniform, and he grinned and walked off. But I had made $20 one night on fire watch. One of my platoon mates had figured out that if he broke into our platoon sergeant's office and crawled out his window, that he would be on top of the mess hall. And from there, it was about, I don't know, 100 yards, maybe if that far, across the top of the mess hall in the dining area, until he met up with a barracks that during our cycle was full of females. I let him out. Half an hour or so, he came back, handed me $20, and went back to bed. Yeah. And then another night, it's all fire stories. I was on fire watch, and I heard a noise coming from the platoon next door. And I walked over and opened their bay, and there was a blanket party going on. Had a guy in their platoon who was always a little slow, a little late, a lot of things. And everything's team. Everything's a team. Everything's a platoon. Everything's a squad. When one person messes up, everybody gets punished for it. And he had been doing this for weeks. And a blanket party. So I walked in and turned to the right, and there were, I don't know, 3 or 4 bunks down from the door. There were 4 or 5 guys holding a blanket, those Army wool green blankets, had the soldier under it. They're all holding it down, and there's about 3 more guys with broom handles.
Oh.
And they're just beating that blanket to death. I just turned around and walked back out. And the next morning, when we're out for our company formation, you could easily pick this guy out of the crowd of his platoon when they came out for formation. But he did a whole lot better after that. He looked pretty bad. He had a couple of knots and a bruise or 2. But after that, they had a whole lot better time.
Interesting.
Corrective training, I think is what they called it.
So where did you head after boot camp?
Actually, I came home. I was going to the Signal Corps school, and my cycle for my class didn't start for 2 or 3 weeks. So I came home for 2 or 3 weeks, and it was a lot different. I couldn't sleep past 4 o'clock no matter what I did. I had to get up, eat, and do something. And my mother noticed that I ate really fast. She mentioned that to me a couple of times, and I still have that problem to this day. I notice a lot that I eat really fast. But so I came home for a couple of weeks, and then I went to Fort Gordon, Georgia, to the Army Signal Corps School, and did, I want to say, 12 or 16 weeks of training there in Signal Corps.
What Signal Corps?
Signal Corps is communications period in the Army. And it doesn't matter if it's microwave communications or radio communications, or if you work on the radios that are in the tanks and the Jeeps and anything at all to do with communications.
Smoke signals?
Well, we were past smoke signals then.
Okay.
We were past Morse code. I don't believe they even taught Morse code then.
Really?
I think that was out by then, which would have been April of '84.
So you were there working, learning your trade.
Yep, I became what's called a tactical circuit controller. Yeah, they gave me that option at the MEPS station in St. Louis. When they asked me what I wanted to do, I said I didn't know. They said after the testing you can do these, and they laid a list of things down. I didn't know what any of them were, and tactical circuit controller looked pretty cool, so I took that one.
Was it the title that looked pretty
Yeah,
cool, or
of course.
the
Yeah, 'cause
things
that's all
that,
it was.
Oh,
It was
okay.
actually there was a 31 in front of it, a 31 November. So when you have your MOS, which is your military occupational specialty, you are a 31 November, which is a tactical circuit controller, or 11 Bravo, which is infantry, and so on.
All right. And so after you learned your new role, where did you go?
My first duty station was Fort Polk, Louisiana, 5th Mechanized Infantry, which is no longer there, I found out. But I was there for a while, and I met a guy there. This would have been the mid to late summer of '84, and to this day he and I are very good friends.
And who's this?
His name is Tim, and he lives in Washington State now. He's from Oregon, and we talk a couple of times a month. We've been through weddings together and babies together, and matter of fact, his oldest daughter is getting married next spring, and my wife and I are going out for that. So he was home. He was here at Malden a few years ago, and my daughter got married. So it's been a nice few years knowing him, 20 plus now.
Did you guys work together, or?
We did. We were actually in the same platoon when I first got there. He was a 31 Mike. He was a VHF radio operator, and sharp guy, good soldier. He actually got out a few years later and then came back in and actually ended up retiring a few years ago.
Now, did you work in a team? Did you work, I mean, how was that organized?
Well, our platoon, actually our company would be assigned to, at that time I was in Bravo Company, so we were assigned to a brigade. I think we were assigned to 1st Brigade and 5th Infantry. And so whenever 1st Brigade would go on an exercise, we would go out with them, set up their communications for them, and for them to also communicate with other brigades or the division headquarters, just whatever was going on. And then another company, say Charlie Company, would have been assigned to 2nd Brigade. Alpha Company is usually assigned to the headquarters for the division. So even though I was a communications person, I kept ending up in infantry units and armored units. So I got to see a lot of neat stuff over the years.
Oh, okay. I hope we talk about that. So, were you doing telephone communication, or?
We did. Our company, actually each company in 5th Signal at the time, did a variety of things. My job, I would set at our site once we went out for a training exercise. All of the communications of any kind would come into my shelter, and then I would make all the necessary connections, whether it was a telephone to the switch. We had a unit, I can't remember the name of it, but it was sort of like a cell phone now. It would be in a vehicle, say a truck or a Jeep or whatever, a Hummer. We didn't have Hummers at the time, but it was sort of like a radio telephone. That would come back to our site even when they were driving around certain areas, and that they would still be connected to the switches as well. And then we would have, before we even deployed, we would have lots of signal tactical circuit or cut sheets, tactical cut sheets, would tell us all of our communications design for that exercise, and so we could set up communications from site to site, across base, across Louisiana, just whatever was needed. But we had radios, we had telephones, we had the guys that took care of the FM radios that you'd see as backpacks, and we had repair personnel and everything you needed just about for communications at the time. Yeah.
So, did you have a commanding officer who had a commanding officer in
sure,
your
yeah.
crew, or?
Well, every platoon would have a platoon leader, which was usually a lieutenant, first or second lieutenant. And then there were, say, 4 to 5 companies or platoons in a company. And then there would be a captain for a company commander. And then you get into the battalion levels. When you start getting into the majors, it would hold different positions, and the colonels and the sergeant majors, and work your way up.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So you're a part of a platoon, and you're running the communication for that platoon,
Well,
or is your platoon all about communication?
Well, the whole battalion, the whole 5th Signal Battalion was all communications.
Oh, okay.
So my platoon was part of a company. Our company was assigned to 1st Brigade.
Oh, okay.
And then our platoons, as we deployed, our platoons almost all mirrored each other, basically. And so we would get assigned like a brigade TOC or brigade TAC, depending on which platoon you were in. Then we would set the communications between our 2 sites, which was basically connecting the brigades, headquarters, and that type of thing. Okay. So when you get done, there's basically a communications site for an entire division.
Wow. And you would just go out in the woods and set this up then?
We would, yep. We went all over Fort Polk numerous times. Went to Fort Hood. I was still pretty young. I got to go to Fort Hood to help plan a mission or a deployment to Fort Hood for a training exercise with 101 Cav, myself and 3 other guys. And then from Fort Polk, I think I went to the Desert Warfare School 3 times, which is a desert training center in Fort Irwin, California. And yeah, so we did lots of deployments. And also from Fort Polk, I went to Reforger, which is the entire division deployed to Germany. Reforger is reoccupation of forces in Germany. And yeah, so we deploy, I mean, everything from our trucks and Jeeps, and the division took tanks, fuel trucks, everything that we owned went to Germany as a deployment.
So
training exercise.
Did you have a truck, or were you like did you have a big semi truck full of stuff?
No, at that time, at Fort Polk, I had a 2.5 ton truck, which we called a deuce and a half, and I had a large commo shelter that sat on the back of that with our communications gear. And most of our vehicles at that time were deuce and a halves. Our communications gear was just so big, and then each one of those vehicles would have a generator to support their own. But then we also had a generator, a very large generator, a big 60 kilowatt diesel generator that would power the entire site. And we had our smaller generators mostly for backup.
Okay. I know we're going to talk about Iraq in a little bit, but I'm wondering about how many different places you were stationed over your career. So
in '84, I went from basic training to AIT, which was Fort Gordon, the signal school, and then to Fort Polk. And then I think I was at Fort Polk about 18 months, and I went to Korea for a year. Korea is a short tour, is what they call it, and it's a year deployment. And then from Korea, I went back to Georgia with Fort Stewart, and it was the 24th Mechanized Infantry. And from Fort Stewart, again, about another 18 months, and I went to Germany, and I did what was supposed to be a 3-year tour in Germany. I was there a few months and went to Iraq, then back to Germany, and we drew down the 1st Armored Division, and then I was sent to Fort Bragg, and Fort Bragg was my last duty station after that.
So you were in Korea. What base or?
A very small camp called Camp Carroll. There was our signal battalion and a couple of other small support, and then there was a civilian operation. If I remember right, a lot of Koreans there, they worked on sights for tanks, laser sights. Yeah, I think that's what they did there. So we had quite a few Korean civilians working on base with us.
Was the city you were in a big city?
Oh, not at all. No, it was less than 1,000 people, and most of the things outside the gate were businesses that made their money off of the camp, the soldiers on the camp. It was great. I loved Korea. It was really good time. I mean, and you walked out of the front gate onto a sidewalk, and there was a 2-lane street. On the other side of that 2-lane street was a sidewalk, and then businesses, mostly restaurants, a few bars, and places to buy clothes and all. But the people in the village were great. They mostly spoke English because they had been there for so long and been around the camp, and the soldiers were always in and out of the gates. And I loved the Korean food. But it was a very small, it was almost in the dead center of South Korea. So just south of me was a larger city called Daegu, and then of course Seoul was much farther to the north, and then Busan was the largest city down on the very southern end of South Korea. And you could get on the train, you know, some weekend and for $8 or something, ride to Busan and eat and drink all the way down and go out to the beach and then get on the train and go back to Waiguan and walk back to Camp Carroll. So.
Was it flat or hilly? Or?
Oh no, it was a lot of terrain. No mountains that I saw, but I guess you could say like the Ozark Mountains. You know, lots of rolling and hilly, and it was really kind of pretty.
And were you there by yourself? Was it just you, or did you bring family over, or were you allowed to bring family?
Korea is considered a short tour, hardship tour is what they called it as well. It's just 1 year, and what they do for that is if you're an NCO, once you talk to your first sergeant and your company commander, they may give you permission to bring your spouse over if you're married. And in that case, since it's considered a short tour, you have to pay for that. Long tours, Germany, other countries, the Army would move your family with you, but the short tours, they would not. And it was made quite clear to you that if anything happened that shouldn't while you were in Korea, your family was going back, and that was it. Okay. So you had lots of clearance over that.
And so your family went with you?
No, well, I was there for a few months, and I did go see my first sergeant and my company commander and asked if I could bring my wife over, and they did let me do that.
Okay. It was just you and her?
Yes.
No critters?
Nope, not at the time, no.
So you're doing the same thing in Korea. Did you guys ever like do some sort of military assignment where you were going and having to set something up in a remote area or anything?
Oh yeah, well that was what we did on a regular basis. Most of our training exercises, since Korea was such a mountainous area, we ended up on a mountaintop somewhere, or a large hilltop. And again, because of the terrain and where we were located, the transmission equipment was usually a tropo dish, which is a large, looks like a satellite dish, but the signal would bounce off the troposphere from one location to another. They even had a few that would bounce off of the troposphere to Hawaii. Wow. And then we'd also have some satellites. But same. Once you got the communication to a site, then it was the same. Telephone setup, field communications, radios, and that kind of thing.
You never had to throw it on your back and haul it up?
No. Those troposphere, that we call the guys that did that, we call them circus workers, because those dishes were so big. To anchor them down, they had stakes that looked like stakes that you would drive down to hold down a circus tent. They were enormous. They were 3 foot long or so, 4 inches diameters, and when they got good, 3 guys could stand around it, and like circus workers could hammer it in. Yeah.
They were probably built, huh?
They could get pretty tough.
And so then you went to Germany at some point, and when you were in Germany, where were you at?
I was stationed with 1st Armored Division in Ansbach, Germany. It was a beautiful town. I really enjoyed Germany as well. Beautiful country. Again, the people were great. The food was great. But the town I lived in was, like most towns in Germany, very old. There were buildings there that had dates on them above the door when they were built before there was the United States. You know, there were 1700s, 1600s, 1500s, and then now they would be a bank, a very modern bank, but they were a building from the early 1700s. But the town was a beautiful town. It was a 1st Armored Division, so we didn't have a big camp that we were on, but there were numerous camps around the city of Ansbach. And you know, the tankers all might be on one camp, the artillery's on another camp, the commo guys and finance and some medics were on a camp, helicopters were at another camp, but we all were in and around the town of Ansbach. I was there when Germany won the World Cup soccer, so that was quite an exciting night. I lived just a few blocks from downtown, and the night they won, a buddy of mine and his wife and my wife, we walked downtown, and it was quite an event. People came out, and fireworks and cheering, and people buying each other drinks and hugging each other, and it was a pretty good night. And then I was also there when the wall came down. So we thought, boy, if they're that fired up over a soccer game, this is going to be great. So my buddy and his wife came over again, and it was kind of cold that night. I remember we put on some coats, and every pocket we could find, we stuck a beer in it, and we headed downtown. And at whatever time, 11 o'clock or midnight, that the wall was supposed to be open, We were in the middle of town. There was nobody else. We stood there for a few seconds. A guy came out of a bar and threw a bottle into the street, and somebody shot off a bottle rocket, and they both went back in, and we went home. And that was it. That was the celebration for the wall coming down in Berlin.
That's hysterical.
It's quite a letdown.
I would imagine. So, you know, I'm kind of interested because nowadays you hear about all of these different terror attacks that are going on and all that kind of stuff. Were you guys dealing with any of those kinds of things?
No,
or
no. The only time that even was a question, because of security, all of the secret, classified, top secret information and equipment that we had, you know, we always talked about that. You know, it was just a daily discussion. All right, when you leave camp, make sure you don't have anything in your pocket. Don't take paperwork out that's classified, that kind of thing. And then, of course, all the camps had guards at the gate. And all around Ansbach, all of the guards were civilian Germans. And even for me to come on every day, even though I know the guys, I had to show them an ID every time. And then there was I'd forgotten, but there was a SOFA agreement, a status of forces agreement card that we carried with us. And it talked about what would happen if you ran into a Warsaw Pact country. And of course, again, it was all Cold War, so it was mostly Russians. You know, you don't talk to them, you don't do this, you don't do this. And watch for vehicles that might look like this and people that might act like this. But nothing ever came of it for me anyway.
Interesting. Interesting. So you're in Germany, and it's what year?
I got there in '88, and then in 1989 was when. I'm sorry, I got there in '89. 1990 was when the Gulf War started, and you know, when all of it first started and we started seeing things were going on, we weren't even on a list for deployment at all. We were just kind of all walking around thinking, well, something may or may not happen. But it did. A buddy of mine and I, again the same guy who we went down to see the soccer celebration and the celebration for the wall. A lot of the units were being tasked all over the country, Germany and the United States, to go to Iraq. And at that time, 1st Armored Division was never mentioned. So Bill and I decided, you know, we're gonna volunteer. We're gonna go somehow. So we both went to our company headquarters one day, and we got on the phone there, and we called our branch, which was we were in the Signal Corps, so our branch was the Signal Corps back at Fort Gordon, and we called to volunteer to be attached to some unit that was going to Iraq, and we were told no, and we were both quite disappointed.
I would imagine.
And then I said it sounds ridiculous if you're not in the military, but hopefully the other military guys will agree that it was sort of like being on the football team and not getting to go to the game, but it was a different kind of game, obviously. Yeah. So yeah, we were told no. We were quite disappointed, and then it wasn't very long after that, maybe a week, just a few days. I remember Bill called me one night just as I was getting ready to go to bed, and he said, "Have you got the TV on?" I said, "No," and he said, "Turn on AFN," which was the Armed Forces Network. So I got the TV on, and I had the phone talking to Bill, and it was General Powell and can't remember who. No, Secretary of Defense said. I can't remember. You think I'd remember that now? If I remember my drill sergeant's name, but they were talking about the build-up for Iraq, and they started reading off some units to be deployed, and 1st Armored Division was one of them. So that's how we found out we were going to Iraq, was we watched it on TV.
Wow.
The next morning, we had an alert call, so we all went into the base earlier than normal, and we went to the theater on base. And it wasn't our battalion commander, it was, it may have been one of the brigade commanders came in, and they said, "First thing we want you to know is we found out the same way you did. We saw it on TV, and then we started getting phone calls."
Wow.
And we were all quite surprised that was how the message would get out. But different times, I guess. I guess that's an easy way to get everybody informed.
I'm going to take you back just a minute
Okay.
because you said that you guys went in and volunteered to go.
Mm-hmm.
What did your wives think of that idea, or did you even?
They were not happy, and that's where the line came out. It's like being on the football team and not getting. And Bill and I both used a similar line, and it wasn't accepted well. Our parents, I remember Bill telling me he told his dad that, and I told my parents that, and they all thought that was rather silly as well. But you know, it's what
that's why you were
signed
there.
up to do. Yeah,
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But I would not want to be on the other side of that conversation. So you find out that you're going to go. So what's it like to prepare to go to? It was Kuwait.
Yes, that's where we went to first, of course. So yeah, we spent a couple of weeks. We ended up leaving the end of November, and I really don't remember if I left before Thanksgiving or not. It was somewhere in that area. But we spent days getting all of our gear ready and getting shots, updating your wheels, updating all your gear, making sure you've got all of your gear, weapons checks, weapons range, lots of skills refreshers, and vehicle maintenance over and over again. You know, how many times can you check that tire? It's still got 38 pounds in it, you know, that kind of thing. But, you know, Germany, we weren't supposed to deploy ever. The next war again was going to be in Europe. So we had never practiced to deploy. Now, while I was in, as I mentioned earlier, when I was in Fort Polk and when I was in Fort Stewart, and I had gone to the Desert Warfare Training School, well, we put our vehicles on trains before, and we'd driven them across country. We put them on ships and sent them up to the Marine base in Carolina. We've done that kind of stuff. But Germany, you know, and again, well, like I said, we went from Fort Polk to a reforger into Germany. So we sent our vehicles around the country, around the world. But in Germany, again, that's where the war was going to be.
Right.
So we didn't even have a plan to deploy. So the whole 7th Corps, which was Germany, 1st Armored Division, 3rd Infantry, lots of large, long history units, we had to figure out how to get all of our vehicles actually to Belgium to put on ships. So some were driven, lots were put on trains and sent to Belgium, put on ships, and then we took airplanes to Kuwait.
So this is a time when the logistics folks really made their money.
They did, and I've been told about a book that somebody had written about that movement, and I should read it. I'm going to have to sometime, but it would be quite a read.
Now, you took your equipment, your trucks. Did you have to change the paint scheme at all, or?
Yeah, good point. So yeah, matter of fact, I've got a picture of that. So we get to, again, we're in Germany, so all of our vehicles, all of our equipment, all of our camouflage is green. There's nothing green in the desert. So I thought I had a picture, yeah, so we had trucks. They were called 1028s. I don't know why, but that's what they were. They were basically a big Chevy pickup. And we had our communication shelters on the back of them. So we get to the desert, and we stand out like sore thumbs. But once we get out into our deployment areas, somebody decided that our green vehicles stood out too much. So that's a green truck and a green communication shelter. Every morning we would get up and dig a hole, pour water into it, make mud, and we painted our vehicles and our shelters every day.
Wow.
But you still see the green tents in the background?
Yeah.
And we still had green uniforms. So.
Don't get out of the truck.
And I want to point out, you see the inverted V?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so every vehicle in the desert that was a coalition vehicle, us, the Brits, the French, and the Kuwaiti, not the Kuwaiti, but the Saudi military, we put those all over our vehicles, on the hoods, on the sides of our shelters. The tanks had them, everything had them, because the American planes, for example, if two planes are coming at each other in the night, they've got, I think they call it a beacon. They can communicate with each other. They know they're friendlies. Same with the tanks and the planes to tanks and so on. But then when you start throwing in the French and the Brits, and so we didn't all have beacons that could communicate. So somebody came up with the idea of the inverted V. Now, why the Iraqis didn't start painting those on all of their vehicles, I don't know, but I guess they didn't know about it. But so yeah, that was our our
Low-tech
color scheme.
solution. I like it.
Yes.
Can you see that at night?
No. Which was a problem.
I would imagine. I've lost train of my thought here. So everything's being shipped over. You're flying over.
Right.
And so when you get off the plane, where are you, and what's that process like?
There was a King Saad military base. I wish I could remember the name of it now. But we left Nuremberg. Commercial airplanes. All of our military planes are all taking equipment. So these civilian planes are landing. They're painted completely white, and we get on with backpacks and duffel bags, and had M16s at the time, and 45s or 9mm for those who had sidearms, and gosh, our gear, our helmets, and all of our personal gear, and our protective gear, and our gas masks, and you know how crowded a regular plane can be. Now throw all of that in. So if you're in an aisle, for example, it was full of gear, and we flew for hours with gear, and yeah, there was no sticking things under the seat in front of you. But the crew, the airplane crew, were stewardesses and the civilian pilots that flew those planes all the time. I was pretty lucky. I ended up sitting up toward the front of the 747, so I had an escape door next to me. So lots of duffel bags there in front of me and gear, and I could stretch my legs out and take a nap. And so yeah, so we left Nuremberg and woke up. We landed in Rome for refueling and kind of a maintenance check. And I remember, you know, nobody really cared. You could see some windows coming open, and everybody was just trying to sleep as much as we could because we didn't know what was going to happen. But you hear somebody, again, they told us on the intercom, we've just landed in Rome, this is our schedule, and we'll be taking off again here in a few minutes. And you hear somebody on the back of the plane, hey, look, there's the Eiffel Tower. Yeah, he got called quite a few names for not knowing his geography, but it kind of lightened the mood for a while. So then we take off again, and I woke up a few hours later, and the stewardesses were all walking around. Everything they could find on that plane that was food or drink, they were filling us up. They were I don't know how many water bottles I had, and some peanut bags and whatever. But the guys that were asleep, the stewardesses were shoving them into their rucksacks. And,
nice.
Yeah, they were emptying that plane out for us. They were great. A couple of times during the flight, the pilots would come back and talk to us. And
do you know what airline it was?
no, they were like I said, all the planes were painted white. The flags were painted over. Just a plain white giant airplane. But yeah, I remember the stewardess that was sort of in the section where I was. She came out one time, and she had on a shooting shirt like somebody who was a trap or target shooter would wear. You had the padded shoulder, and it was one of the pilots. And she said he wanted everybody to sign us, so she was walking around with felt markers, and by the time she got done, that white shirt was just covered in signatures. And
that's cool.
I don't know what he ever did with it. I assume he kept it. I don't know that.
I'm sure it's hanging on a wall somewhere.
Maybe.
That's very cool. That's very cool. So you get off the plane, and where are you?
Again, we're at that military base that I can't remember the name.
And is this in Saudi Arabia?
It is in Saudi. Yep. Because remember, this was a NATO event. We weren't there to go to war with Iraq. We were sent over there to get Iraq out of Kuwait. That's what the whole plan was. Right. And so, yes, we landed in Saudi, and we were taken to TAA Thompson, which was sort of a marshalling area. And there were tent after tent. So I don't know who this young guy is, but you can see these rows and rows of, we called them GP larges. It was a pretty good sized tent. And they slept quite a few people. And we were there for weeks waiting on the ships to show up with all of our vehicles, all of our equipment, or the majority of our equipment. So yeah, so there we were fed horrible food, contract food. Saudis were cooking for us, and I assume it was traditional Saudi food, I don't know, but we all got quite hungry. We started eating all the rations we could find and steal and hoard, and lots of dirty, sandy nasty time because there were no facilities there really,
Right.
showers or otherwise. They kept building those the longer we were there.
Right.
But you're there and you're really not knowing when your equipment's going to show up. And by this time I've been a sergeant for a few years by this time, but you can't let downtime happen. You don't want to work everybody to death, but you can't let them get bored and start thinking, oh, what am I going to do if, and how are my kids? So you spent all day training of some type, and then at some point during the day, we would try to do something for fun, which usually ended up being football with our Kevlar helmets on, or football with our gas masks on, or softball with no bats or balls, and somehow we ended up with a football or two. But lots of training and retraining and just anything you could do really to keep everybody's mind off of how hot it was and how long we were going to be there, and that it was going to be bad for a long time.
Oh, okay.
Lots of, I really tried to get people to write letters, because moms and dads and wives and sisters and brothers, they all wanted to know what was going on. And mail call was a surprisingly big deal. When the mail would show up, it was a big deal. It was fun.
And this is probably before they were able to put any internet access
Oh yeah,
in.
There was a AT&T, I think we called it a Fest tent. I don't know why that, but AT&T somehow got this tent full of phones set up in T.A. Thompson and somewhere else. Of course, it wasn't nearly enough for the thousands of people that were just there with 1st Armored Division. But of course, I love being a sergeant, but this was the kind of times when it wasn't so great. You always make sure the soldiers get to go in and call home. So that's just part of being a supervisor. You didn't get to do it all the time. I think I got to make a phone call or two, but that's fine. That's the way it.
Good leader takes care of their crew. So how long were you at that base?
Let's see. That was November, and probably end of December for sure. And then we got all of our vehicles together. The ships came in, we got everything unloaded, did some more training and testing and maintenance work. And then we went to another forward base. We drove up something called Tapline Road, which is, I think it was an acronym, of course military had acronyms, for the Trans-Saudi Pipeline, something like that. And we went to another forward area to really start getting ready to deploy out, to get ready for the war. And just convoy after convoy, hundreds of vehicles, and it was just, again, if you weren't, just pay attention. Just the stuff that was going on was really amazing. The numbers of people and the equipment, and the Saudis, they didn't care. This road you can see forever is just as flat as any tabletop. All you can see is sand and dirt and this black asphalt, and we're driving anything from a pickup up to a 5-ton truck and tractor trailers, and on a 2-lane highway. And they would just drive in and out like you would see in New York City, the taxi drivers, Wow. And it was just constant. So there was always a wreck of some type, and but yeah, it was quite entertaining as well.
When you were first there, did they give you any cultural?
Actually, we did that before we went.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I remember we were up in our commons area in our barracks building, and they talked about different hand gestures you could and couldn't do. Don't show the soles of your feet. That was a big deal, yeah. You couldn't do the OK sign because that meant something. But not a lot. Even during that day when we had that kind of thing, it was mostly a security and briefings and that kind of thing. Because we weren't expected to see civilians, but you just didn't know for sure.
Right. And so you had said that the Saudis were cooking for you. Mm-hmm. Were you able to cook any of your meals or any of that stuff?
Well, of course, we had our mess crew with us. Our dining crews all went as well. And of course, we had to wait for our mess vehicles to get there. And they did have, when they could, they would make hot meals. We got a few hot meals in the T.A. Thompson, and some fresh fruit mostly. And then at that time, by that time, there weren't C rations anymore. We had what was called MREs in a brown bag, dehydrated foods of different types. And then the mess teams started getting what was called T rations. And it would be a metal, like the size of a large cookie sheet, maybe 2 to 3 inches deep, and sealed metal, and they would dump them in boiling water. And they would bring it out and take off this metal lid like an old sardine can, and it may be scrambled eggs, or it may be sausage, or it may be macaroni and cheese, or mashed potatoes. So, and those actually weren't bad. The MREs were much worse, really.
I'm just picturing Thanksgiving.
Yeah, that's about what it was too. No, actually, excuse me, Thanksgiving. So I know I was there before Thanksgiving because we had Thanksgiving in the desert, and we were eating some kind of a Saudi sausage that, well, eating was a little generous. We tried it. It was we lost a lot of weight.
Did you, like, was there ever, like, any of these big commander people ever come over and shake hands, or?
Well, not really. Everybody was so busy. You know, the commanders were just as busy as everybody else. Major General Griffith was our division commander, and then Lieutenant General Tommy Franks was the 7th Corps commander. I want to say I saw him once we got there. General Griffith, I saw him more often because my platoon was assigned to the headquarters operations center, so I'd pass him sometimes. But again, you know, they were just as busy as, they were busy planning and developing and coming up with movements and making sure we had food and personnel and healthcare and all of that. So they were more busy than the soldiers, really, just different ways.
So how long of preparation did you have before you actually had to go in?
Into Kuwait. Well, I didn't get to Kuwait until after the war.
Oh, okay.
Once the ground war was over. So we went from T.A. Thompson to another forward area, and then we actually deployed way out west. I can't remember what they called the area we were sent to, but this was even before the air war started, so this was still in December.
Oh, okay.
And the ground war didn't start until February. So in December, we were sent out to basically where we were before the war started, and we stayed there. We hadn't been there very long, and we were told that we were getting Hummers, Humvees, and at the time, like I said, we still had pickup trucks, and that's how I got this vehicle I showed you earlier, the green to brown Humvee. We sent, I want to say, 140 something soldiers back to the port in Saudi, and they were unloading Humvees just constantly. I don't know how many the division got or how many the Corps got, but there were Humvees just spread all over these shipyards. And our company needed X number, so we put X number of soldiers in I don't know, half a dozen Deuce-a-halves, just throw in the back. We drove most of a day to get back to the port. We put somebody in every Humvee, except for the 2 drivers of the trucks, half a dozen trucks, whatever it was. And there was a captain who I didn't even know. He got in the first Humvee and he said, "Follow me." And he said, "Make sure they work." So you give a bunch of 18 to 22-year-old brand new Humvee and said, "Make sure it works." You can imagine our ride back. I don't know if a brake was ever used or if an accelerator was ever let up, but by the time we got back, they needed a little bit of maintenance done to them because they were literally brand new.
Oh, wow.
They still had the military version of stickers on the windows.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we get back, and they had sent 2 large cranes to our site to take our communication shelters, pick them up. We had basically two lines of vehicles, and the cranes in the middle. We'd pull up with your vehicle and your new vehicle on either side of the crane, and when you got there, you already had the tie-down shackles that was holding your shelter on your truck loose. You pull up, he connects to your vehicle or your shelter, swings onto the new vehicle, then you both drive off, and here comes the next 2. Mm-hmm. And my shelter, because of the way it was built, it was slightly smaller than others, and it didn't fit on that Humvee quite right. So the guy who worked for me, Richard Franco, he and I we spent quite some time trying to figure out how we were going to make this work, make it stay on that Humvee. And after a while, our company commander came by and he said, "Sergeant Green, you get it fixed or we're putting you back on a pickup." Well, that gave Franco and I a lot of incentive, so we started finding every bolt and wrench and piece of cable and the shackles that we could come up with. And when we got done, it stayed on there. It stayed on there until we got done with it anyway.
Nice, nice. So now you've got your trucks, your equipment, And you're going to a forward operating base, is that
we
correct?
were actually deployed out on the phase
Okay.
line by then. We were just waiting for the war to start then.
Okay, all right.
So
And
we were out there.
while you were there, you know, who else was on your base?
Oh, no, it was our communication site. Again, since it was a desert, and it's not the desert you see with the sand dunes and all. It was flat and hard, this hard packed stuff. So we got our communication site set up. We set up our perimeter, dug all of our foxholes, set up our tents, our mess area, and once you just looked in any direction around you, there was another site of some type set up, whether it was a maintenance site or say the Air Force liaison officer site or the division main site, you know, just site after site. That's all you could see was tents and vehicles and trucks, and we actually were in a pretty safe area because the tanks were in front of us and the artillery and the helicopters were behind us, so we were pretty well covered. But yeah, the terrain, the ground was so hard that the engineers had to come over and dig our foxholes for us. We couldn't put a shovel in the ground, and of course, being everything's run off of electricity for us, we could every communication shelter had a 8-foot long ground rod. We had to drive in the ground, but we couldn't do it. Couldn't drive in the ground, so we would lay the ground rod down, drive the truck tires on top of it, and throughout the day we would pour water on the ground rod, and that's how we kept our grounds for all of our electronics.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was
Wow.
But so yeah, so then we had our site set up with all of our foxholes, and we spent December to the ground war started on the 24th, I think, of February, and every day was, of course, maintaining all the communications, doing maintenance, guard duty. You know, during the day, every other foxhole was manned, and during the night, we had 2 people in every foxhole. So yeah, we stayed busy. We had a pretty good lieutenant, very good lieutenant, who I found on the internet, found on the magical Facebook, and dadgummit, he looks just like he did then. Good guy. He retired as a colonel, as a matter of fact. So he did a lot to keep guys, you know, from going too crazy. Somehow he came up with a set of horseshoes. I don't know how he did it, and stakes. So we had a little horseshoe pit set up, and he even came, got myself and a couple other guys one night, and we put on our night vision goggles, and we had a midnight horseshoe tournament. So yeah,
wow.
our equipment was used wisely, obviously.
Right. Did you ever get a fun care package that you remember?
Yeah, I did. Who told you all this? So yeah, yeah, somebody was always sending something from. I got a lot of things from Malden, and my dad's stepmother would send a box of whatever, you know, if it had Pop-Tarts or candy or Coke or whatever in it, and they found this nylon packing tape that it was a good thing I had a bayonet with me, because there was not getting that package open any other way. It was, but you know, the packages, the letters. My sister sent me. Yeah, matter of fact, I've got another picture. This is great. So this is laundry day for me. I'd found a bucket, and I had a lot of dirty clothes, and that's how I did laundry. I actually used a bar of soap to do my laundry, but that's the way we all had it. I mean, there was no laundry facilities, so that was trying to get some of the crud off. But you see, I've got a set of headphones on. My sister had sent me a package that had the Prairie Home Companion show. It was 2 cassette tapes. It was a full show, and I started listening to it that day, as a matter of fact, when I was doing the laundry, and I listened to the first tape, and I flipped it over and listened to the side 2. I put the next tape in for side 3, and it was side 1. And I flipped it over, and it was side 2. So I had 2 tapes of side 1 and 2. So out of boredom one day, I wrote the publicist off of that cassette package. A few weeks later, I got that new package. She sent a second one, and then she also sent me about a 2-page letter about her husband being in Vietnam, and
wow, that's neat.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. It was nice.
That was
it
really
was fun.
cool. That's very
and
cool.
And at that time, we still had the Ann Landers Any Soldier letters, and this is, I'll never forget this. I don't know what I did with it, but one night going in to eat, somebody had gotten a big box of the letters from somewhere. When they went back to get supplies, they just picked up a big package of them, and it was sitting by our mess trailer. I just grabbed one, stuck it inside my flak jacket, went and ate, went and did my duty that night, and got back into my tent, which I think I even have a picture of my tent, yeah. So myself and 2 other sergeants slept in that tent, and you see the 2 different colors is because it's 2 different tents. Okay. We had a tent that got blown in half in a storm one night, and then after that, our second tent got blown in half. So that's why I've got 2, well, it looks like 2 tents, because it is. That was what we had.
You were part of the engineering crew.
Yeah, exactly. So I get back to the tent that night, and myself and Bill, the guy who volunteered with me to go, we were in there talking, and another sergeant, I can't remember his name, and I just happened to remember I had that letter. I pulled it out, opened it up, and I told you I was born in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. This letter was from a girl who was in the 4th grade in Bartlesville, Oklahoma.
Wow.
Yeah. So she and I wrote each other probably half a dozen times.
Oh, neat.
While I was over there, and I had the letters for a while. I don't know, like a lot of things, I've lost track of them.
That's
so,
very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I've always wondered, what she was doing now. But
that would be cool.
if I could ever run across them again, I may try and find out.
Yeah, that's neat. That's neat. Well, Facebook, you'll be able to find them.
Yeah, if I can find the letters. Yeah.
That's very cool. So what's the funniest thing that ever happened to you while you were over there?
Well, we had a guy in my platoon. Somehow he talked some Bedouins, some Saudi Bedouins came by with half a dozen camels. Don't know where they came from or where they were going, because there was nothing out there. When they left, this guy had a chicken. This guy in my platoon. I don't know where the Saudis had the chicken, what they were doing with it, but this guy ended up with their chicken when they left. I don't know what he gave them for the chicken, but he guarded that chicken, because that chicken, it was threatened to be eaten quite a few times.
Oh yeah, I would imagine.
But he had built a cage on the top of his Humvee, on top of the cab, and that's how that chicken traveled with us from then on. When we would move, that chicken was in that cage on top of that Humvee.
Was it a rooster or a chicken?
It was. No, well, it was a rooster, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was quite proud of it, and there was no getting away from him.
Wow. So what happened to the chicken when you guys left?
Don't know. I don't know whatever happened to it. When the ground war was over, before we got back to Kuwait City, it was gone. I don't know if he let it go or what, but it was gone.
So you were talking about somebody that started a garden?
That was a buddy of mine who actually, it was Tim, my buddy who I said I'm still friends with. He actually, when he deployed to Afghanistan a few years later, somehow ended up with some pumpkin seeds, and he had a pumpkin garden in Afghanistan. So.
Okay, all right. I thought that was when you were there. So, do you have if you think back to this time, is there a really vivid memory that you have?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I took the headphones apart. We'd come across a tank that had been had broken down. It was an Iraqi tank that had broken down, and I got a tanker's helmet out of it. And so I took those headphones apart and took the wiring out of that tanker's helmet and put those headphones inside the tanker's helmet. And my company commander tried to buy those off of me. So little things like that. But then, when the ground war started, I remember we sitting in our convoy, and they were blowing the holes through the berms on the border with Saudi and Iraq, and we were getting ready to go through that. I remember that because it was finally, well, dadgum, here it goes. Their war, of course, had been going on for 39 days, I guess, by then.
Right.
And then again, Franco and I, our vehicle, between he and I, we had 2 M16s, we had an M60 machine gun, we had Claymore mines, we had an AT-4 anti-tank shoulder-fired rocket. We had thousands of M60 rounds, and this was all in the cab of that 2-seat truck. Wow. Had a few hand grenades, and we thought, if we hit something, if we hit an IED, if we hit a landmine, we're done. So he and I, we got every sandbag we could find, and we lined our floorboard with sandbags, just in the hopes that, excuse me, if we did hit something, that would help, because it was going to be a mess.
Wow.
And we ran over a body one night. When the ground war started, things were just moving so fast. The convoy one night, it was my CO in the first vehicle and his driver, first sergeant, and then myself and Franco. And I was driving at the time, and we kept 3 vehicle length distance between all of us or whatever. And I ran over something, And I said, Franco, I think that was a guy. And about that time, the CO pulled up beside me and said, sir, was that a, he said, yep, it was. He said, we're going back to, but he'd been there for quite some time. But it's just things like that that just, you know, you don't think about them for a long time and all of a sudden they'll pop in.
Yeah.
You know, the tankers, tankers are a different crew. Those guys, they were moving so fast all the time, they never tried to even put up a tent or a shelter. Once the ground war started, that wasn't possible for anybody.
Right.
But those guys, even before the ground war started, they didn't like being in tents for some reason, and they had come across a bunch of body bags. So they would lay out body bags and put their sleeping bags inside these body bags to keep the sand from blowing on them, and they slept in there. Yeah, I couldn't do that. Some of them offered me some body bags, and some of the guys took them. I couldn't do it. I just slept in my sleeping bag.
You had asked me to ask you about belt. What is it? Body belt bags?
Body bags. That was it. Yeah. The tankers.
Okay.
Yeah. They.
Okay.
I don't know where they got them or how they got so many, but
Okay.
it was a pretty popular item for a while.
Wow. Well, I guess, you know, if you get tired of dealing with all of the sand blowing in your face, it makes sense.
It got to be a pain. Somebody, before the ground war started again, somehow we came up with a television. When the guys would go back on supply runs, when they came back, somebody always had something odd. I began to like Perrier water because water was just horrible, just constant. And somebody came back one time and had like 2 cases of Perrier. Don't know why, but we drank it and kind of got to like it. But somebody came back and had a TV and had a VCR player built in. And you know, we thought, well, that's useless. We're not going to have anything to do with this. Well, somebody sent like a tape of the Super Bowl and different things. And in Malden, they had a parade here. I don't remember what the date was. I wish I knew. But it was just kind of a support our troops parade. And somebody videotaped it. And my mother had sent me a copy of it. So I got a bunch of guys together one night and said, let's go in this tent. I got something I want you all to see. So here, again, Malden, this little farm town, with the main roads going through town, still have ditches on the side. You know, we don't have much underground storm service. And it, you know, it was a little town, people walking and with radios playing patriotic music and waving flags and people, you know, giving speeches and whatnot. And so we're in there watching it, and I don't know, there must have been 20 of us in there, I guess, if that many. And I'm taking some pretty good ribbing, this little country town, and oh, look at this, you got ditches on the sides of the road, and hey, or there's tractors in the parade, you know, I was taking some ribbing. But when it was over with, all those guys that were ribbing me, as we were headed out that night, they would all come by and say, hey, Sergeant Green, that was pretty neat. Tell everybody thanks. Yeah, so cool. it was ribbing and some fun in the tent, but they all liked it.
That's good.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
That's good. Well, if they weren't ribbing you, it didn't mean that they liked it. So.
That's right.
That's awesome. So let me look at my notes a little bit here. When the war did start, did the Iraqis do anything that?
Actually, there were some reconnaissance flights sent. And really, for quite some time, the date for the ground war to start was set. I mean, for weeks. So a day or so, or hours before the ground war was supposed to start, there were some reconnaissance flights, and they came back saying, you know, there's going to be very little contact in this first certain distance, and I don't remember what the distance is. But again, they had built these large berms, so the engineers had bulldozers and all kinds of equipment like that, but they also had this thing called a MICLIC. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but a tank would fire out this long rope of explosives, and it looked just like a giant white sock being fired out for quite a few yards, and that thing would hit the ground and they would set off and it would explode, and it would blow these berms. It would blow an area that they thought was mined or had unexploded ordnance. They're quite powerful, loud, right. But they cleared quite a wide berth. But we were well west of Kuwait. West of us was the 18th Airborne Corps, which is Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Fort Stewart, Georgia, which I left to come to 1st Armored Division, and Fort Bragg. And then it was us, it was 7th Corps, which is 1st Armored Division, 3rd Infantry. There was a British unit with us. So you know, we had, you know, lots of folks for miles and miles on either side of us. So yeah, so when the ground war started and we took off, things went fast and ugly, and we didn't set up for the 4 days of the ground war. We did not stop long enough to set up comms for anybody. The artillery was so accurate. You know, there was no terrain. The tanks, the maximum effective range of the tanks, their whatever it was, you know, it was almost double because they could just see forever. And again, the nights were so bright and clear. So yeah, we stopped a couple of times because the 18th Airborne Corps and us, we were moving so fast, the fuel supply couldn't keep up with us. So we were having trouble getting fuel sometimes. But yeah, we would come up on tanks. Again, we were behind the tankers. We'd come through where there was a battle, and there would be piles of metal that if you didn't know what a tank looked like before, you had no idea what that was.
Oh, wow.
And then I remember we came upon one tank, and of course it was all Soviet equipment that they had too. So all that training from basic training 8 years before, oh, that's a T-72, that's a T-65, and yeah. So, but there was a Soviet tank that had been hit, and the turret was blown off of it, and it had come upside down and landed right back down on the turret ring.
Oh, wow.
And you could see one hole in the side of the turret where whatever went in there just blew it up, flipped it over, and came right back down where it was.
Wow.
But the Iraqis too, for some reason, with their tanks, they were digging holes and they were burying their tanks in with just their turrets out. So their maneuverability was none. So it was fast, it was ugly. The ground war just hammered them. Excuse me. I had a friend who was an Apache pilot, and when we got back to Germany, it was the first time I get to see him since before the war started, and he had to get out. The things that he had done and had seen ate him up.
Can't imagine.
It was pretty brutal.
Can't imagine.
But our division, we only lost 2 people, I believe, the whole 1st Armored Division. I think one was a training accident and one was something that did happen during combat, but it was a pretty one-sided affair.
Any friendly fire incidents?
There were, none that I was involved with or near me, but there were a few. Again, it came back to the inverted V and the lack of beacons between some vehicles. And
you had told me a small story about somebody that got lost.
Oh, yeah, so that was before the ground war again. And I mentioned we had Brits attached to our division as well. So one night I had Sergeant of the Guard. One of the guards is yelling at me, Sergeant Green, and I ran over to his foxhole. And he was outside at the time, and we could tell there was a vehicle coming toward us because of the marker beacon on the front of it. And we had a international challenge and password to be issued because we had so many forces over there. And we got the vehicle stopped, and before he could even issue the challenge, you hear this voice. You couldn't see the vehicle or even see the person, it was so dark, but you hear, "Don't shoot, mate, we're Brits." So after he and I get done laughing, and we did get them the challenge and the password issued, they came on the site and slept that night. So they were lost.
Oh, okay. So were you there during the fires?
Yes. That was
What was
quite a
that
mess
like?
as well. Black 24 hours a day, and you could see the fires from miles and miles and miles away. It was quite a mess. This covered in soot, again for miles away. The sun shining through the black smoke. Yeah, it was. You could taste it on everything. You could feel it everywhere. It was quite a mess, and those things were on fire as far as you could see.
Was this something that they were anticipating or not?
I don't know. You know, I don't know. It makes sense that they did it, and so I would have to imagine that they anticipated it.
I was just wondering if they gave you guys any special stuff to
The
wear.
only thing we had special ahead of time was, again, the shots before we deployed, and then we were given some pills because they were convinced that we were going to get into some chemical warfare from Saddam at some time with those Scud missiles he had. Right. And they were just a small white pill, I remember that. And we had to take them every day. And lots of guys would get sick after they took them, stomach pain, vomiting.
So you're in Kuwait, you're pushing the guys out. How did things, like what was the conclusion, or, you know, what happened at the end?
course, we were given quite a few hours notice before the ceasefire, so everybody pretty much had stopped by then because, like I said, the Republican Guard that was just supposed to be devastating was just, those poor guys, the Iraqis, they were hungry, dirty, ill-fed, ill-equipped, had been out there for so long. They would try to surrender to anything that moved. But the Republican Guard did fight. They were just overwhelmed. But any camp that you came across or destroyed vehicle, quite a few times as we were driving, and just our vehicles, you'd have Iraqi soldiers run into you trying to surrender, but we just couldn't take them. We couldn't do anything with them.
Okay. So you'd just leave them there, or
yeah.
take their.
They had nothing. They would just have on pants and shirts most of the time.
Oh wow.
We'd throw them some water and some rations and
That was
keep going.
nice of you to do.
Well, we couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there were lots of MPs around picking them up. So.
Right. So you push them out, and then do you stay or?
No, we actually once we got to Kuwait, and do you remember the news about Death Highway? There was a road
a little bit.
that when the Iraqis left Kuwait, they stole every vehicle that would move, and they headed north out of Kuwait on this divided 4-lane road, and the Air Force and the Army Air just devastated them. It was just.
And this is something that you saw?
That was done before we got to Kuwait. When we got to Kuwait, the engineers had already gone in with bulldozers and just plowed it all off of the side of the highways like a big snow pile. Wow. So when we got there, there were just bodies and vehicles piled along the side of the road for miles.
Wow.
Miles. It was a terrible mess. Yeah, it was.
Wow.
Yeah, that's something that if you want to look at it, you can obviously find it on the internet. But it was that was something I didn't even take pictures of. It was a mess.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to remember that anyway. So, did you then build a base somewhere else, or?
Well, we actually pretty quickly got through Kuwait and got back to that TAA Thompson. Because while we're doing this, what they call the big left hook, the Marines and the Navy were just, and the Air Force were just hammering Kuwait and getting, running them out, running the Iraqis out. And so we pretty much just drove through Kuwait, I want to say in a day. And we ended up getting back to TAA Thompson and pretty much started getting ready to go home after that, cleaning up, getting the gear ready to go home, and ended up, we left everything there.
Oh.
Tents, trucks, camo gear.
Left everything there?
Yep.
Did you disable it or just left the keys in it?
I have in my head that it was left for the Saudi Kuwaiti military. Don't know if that was the case, but yeah, tanks, trucks, everything. You're talking thousands of vehicles. I think 1st Armored Division had over 300 tanks, 300 Bradley fighting vehicles, and thousands of support vehicles, which would have been us, fuel, any kind of supply vehicles you could think of, generators. Yeah, it all stayed there.
Oh. Did you collect any memorabilia or anything while you were over there?
So in our rations, we had small bottles of Tabasco sauce. And everywhere I went, I would fill it up with sand, write a date on it, and where I was at the time. And when we got ready to load up and start actually heading back to Germany, they said, okay, now remember, nothing gets on the plane. Make sure you don't have any rounds in your pocket. You don't have this, you don't have this. And for some reason, they decided we weren't allowed to take anything out of country that we didn't bring with us. And that meant sand, rocks, anything that you might have picked up, any kind of souvenir at all, couldn't take it.
Wow.
So I had to dump out all those bottles of sand. And I remember when I got home, one of the first things I saw on TV about General Schwarzkopf was an interview with him, and he had these bottles of sand in his hand that he had filled up everywhere he had been. But hey, when you're a 4-star general, I guess you could do that.
Yeah, I guess you could do anything you want.
That's right.
Well, that's kind of a shame. So, um, so you go back to, is it Germany that
Yep,
you go
went
back
to
to?
Ansbach. I actually, my first sergeant and I, and my platoon leader, another 2 or 3 of us for our company went back, I want to say 2 days before the rest of our company did, because we had to get back, open up the camp, get the barracks opened up, make sure that we had a barracks ready to accept a few hundred people to move back into, which meant all the facilities, the water, the mess halls were getting ready again.
Well, if you get back there, but you left your equipment,
Mm-hmm.
what are you working with?
Oh, no. It was, we were completely getting ready to accept a battalion's worth of people back into these buildings that had been empty for 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah, we had to
right.
unlock the doors and get the arms room ready to
Okay.
accept all the.
Order
we did bring
new
our weapons
equipment?
back,
Oh, okay.
but as far as our motor pools were empty from then on.
Oh, wow.
So yeah.
And
But
did you resupply or?
No. That's how I get sent back to Fort Bragg, when we were actually starting to draw down the forces in Germany before Iraq kicked off. So we came back with no gear. That basically just
That's
helped
why
us
they sent you.
prepare.
Okay.
To break. But I remember when we got ready to leave our Kuwait or Saudi to go home, the chaplain came around to start talking to us in these large groups. And my daughter, who was born in Fort Stewart before I went to Germany, was 3 when I got home. She had a birthday. And he said, okay, how many in here have children? And a bunch of us raised our hands. How many in here have children under the age of 4? And a few of us raised our hands. And he said, when you get home, your children are not going to know you. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, that's not true. And he said, I don't care what you've done, how many people have showed them pictures, how many people have talked to them about you, they're not going to know who you are. Yeah, not going to happen. Not going to happen. So I remember being on the bus back at Ansbach after we landed in Nuremberg and rode the buses back. We pulled up to the middle of the camp, and there was a kind of a park on the caserne, and of course all the family was out there in the parks. And I looked out and saw my wife and my daughter, and I got off of the bus and ran toward my daughter, and she ran from me. Yeah.
Wow.
It like it killed me for a couple of seconds, and then I thought, that damn chaplain. And then I thought, well, I'm glad he told me. Yeah. The rest of that day was pretty. I really worked at trying to get her to, but she just kept. She wouldn't run away from me much longer, but she'd kind of turn away from me. But the next day, when she got out of bed, everything I did, I had a 3-year-old girl around my leg. Nice. She wouldn't let me go. And when I left to go up to the camp that day to help start getting things opened up, oh, she cried and carried on. But when I came home again, it was the same, and that was pretty nice.
Yeah.
It was tough leaving and tough being gone, and it was tough when I came off that bus. But yeah, it was a few days of some fun.
Wow. Ouch. So, I know you got out. Mm-hmm. So why did you leave the military?
Well. So after we drew down in Germany, was sent back to Fort Bragg with quite a few of the guys from Germany, as a matter of fact. A lot of us met up at Fort Bragg, so I had another year left, and kind of decided that one war was enough, and didn't know what was going to happen, if there was going to be another one. And I was only active duty for 9 years, and like I said, I went from Georgia to Louisiana to Korea to Georgia to Germany and Iraq, back to Germany, and now Fort Bragg. And I was tired of moving around. It was just, I just had the bad luck of the draw. I moved so much. That's all it was to it. Just some bad luck, bad timing. And with a daughter, I wanted to have a house and a yard, even if it was on a military base. But I never got to stay anywhere more than like 18 months. And so I was at Fort Bragg, and a few months, 6 months or so before your enlistment's up, your first sergeant talks to you about re-enlisting, the good soldier thing, and we need you, and stay. And I said, top, which is what you called your first sergeant. I said, top. I said, I've been in 8.5 years now, and this is my 8th duty station. And he didn't believe me. He got my records, and he started flipping my records. I think he had been in almost 20, and that was his 3rd duty station. So yeah, he didn't have much of an argument
Wow.
to persuade me to stay in then. But and I actually wanted to go to D.C. and be in the honor guard. I wanted to be a guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and I tried. I called them. I talked to some people there. They wanted me to come. Unfortunately, my MOS, my 31 November, wasn't MOS that they had in the honor guard, which is actually 3rd Infantry. So they couldn't take me. They offered. They told me, if you can call your signal branch, get them to reclassify you into one of these MOSs that we do have, we'll take you. We want you. So I called branch and said, they'll take me if you'll let me do this. And they said, no, we can't reclassify you because it was going to be a downgrade in skills. And I called the folks back at 3rd Infantry, and they said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. So I got out.
That's a shame.
Came home.
Well, we're glad to have you back. So, is there anything else that you would like to share?
I don't think so. I think you picked me pretty well.
No.
It was absolutely worth doing. I'm glad I got to do it. You know, you asked me if I was a patriot at the beginning, but you know, again, I said when I went in, I was only 20 years old. But the older I got, and the more I asked, you know, about my family, my dad had 5 brothers who were all in the military. One was killed in Germany. One was a guard at the Nuremberg trials. Others were in the Pacific and in Europe. And 2 of his sisters married military guys. On my mother's side, my 3 uncles were in the military, and my aunts married military guys.
Oh, wow.
So I'm surrounded by military people on both sides, which is great. But you know, that wasn't it. Again, I was just a young guy and trying to find my direction.
Right.
Yeah.
When you were in Germany, did family come over?
Yeah, quite often. Yeah, parents, cousins. Yeah, and my sister lived in Switzerland. I'd forgotten to mention that. I hadn't seen my sister in 6 or 8 years because when she would move for work and I would get transferred. So, yeah, when I got to Germany, it was the first time I met her husband, and it was the first time she had seen my daughter, who was 3. Wow. So we had our own little bit of a family get together quite often.
I bet you it was
great.
a pretty great reunion.
I got to Germany, and immediately went on a training exercise, called my sister, said, I'm gone for 3 weeks. When I get back, I'm going to come see you. And I came back, and we got in late that night, and I was just sitting in the motor pool, just kind of catching my breath, and somebody came out and said, Sergeant Green, you need to call your father at your sister's, which was in Switzerland again. And
wow.
she'd been diagnosed with leukemia.
Oh, no.
So the first time I got to see her in numerous years, she was in an isolation unit in a hospital, and,
wow.
and I spent almost every weekend I could on the train or driving
wow.
back to Switzerland. And
wow.
Matter of fact, I was at her house when they called me and said, okay, we got to get ready to deploy now. So I'd driven down that day and got a phone call that night and turned around and drove back
wow.
home. So it was she and I had a
wow.
couple of tough years together.
Well, but, you know, as horrible as it sounds, it's so great that she had her brother
yeah.
with her.
Yep. She's since had 2 kids, and everything's great. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Things are up.
Good, good. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your story. And thanks for your service.
Well, thank you.